Warmongers have met in Paris, and peacemakers have met in Riyadh. How those debates turn out is going to, I think, change the geopolitical landscape of the world. A tectonic shift is underway right now, and how these two meetings turn out and what results as it comes about as a result of them, I think is something that is going to profoundly change the world that we have. And folks, it ain't going to work out the way some people think. And there's a lot of folks at high levels that are not prepared for the changes that are now being foisted upon them. Now, we're going to start off in Riyadh, where the United States and Russia met for the first time officially since before this war began. The United States was led by the Secretary of State Rubio. The Russian side was led by their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. After the meeting was over, we got the first hint of really what all this was about and what we can expect to come when Secretary Rubio outlined 4 outcomes from this meeting today.
We've agreed on 4 principles that I think are important. The first is that we're going to appoint our teams respectively to work very quickly to reestablish the functionality of our respective missions in Washington and in Moscow. For us to be able to continue to move down this road, we need to have diplomatic facilities that are operating and functioning normally. The second point is that we're going to appoint a high-level team from our end to help negotiate and work through the end of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that's enduring and acceptable to all the parties engaged. The third point is to begin to work at a high level as well to begin to discuss and think about and examine both the geopolitical and economic cooperation that could result from an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, we'd have to see that conflict come to a successful and enduring end in order for that to be possible. And the last thing we agreed to is that while our teams are going to be working on all of this, the 4 of us who were here today, the 5 of us that were here today, are going to remain engaged in this process to make sure that it's moving along in a productive way.
Now, this meeting was ostensibly to talk about ending the Russia-Ukraine war. And the fact that it existed at all is a testament to just how significant things have changed in the United States and ergo in the Western world. You may recall that we showed on our channel some number of months back a soundbite of then Secretary of State Blinken, who was asked if he had talked to Sergei Lavrov anytime soon. And he mocked that, well, I mean, I talked to him on the side of a certain meeting, but that's it. I mean, we're certainly not going to talk to him, as though that was some measure or mark of elegance, as though that were strength somehow, like that to dare to talk to the Russian side is like looking down my nose. And of course, I wouldn't do that. That was always an absurd thing to do and has harmed international relations, has harmed American interest abroad. It has kept the risk of conflict between Russia and the United States alive when it should have been taken off the board a long time ago. And perhaps most consequential, at least in the near term, is it has resulted in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men to be killed, whole sections of their country handed over to or taken, not handed over, taken by the Russians, and entire cities literally turned to dust. That is the enduring legacy of the Biden administration, and by extension, on the Western world, because the rest of NATO fell in line, the rest of Europe fell in line. Nobody would talk about Russia. Nobody would talk to Russia, rather. Everyone instead just took the easy path and demonized Russia. So we held that up as an element of something that's sophisticated, that powerful. That's what strong people do. They don't talk to their enemies. They wait until they come to us on their knees. Well, that would be fine if that's the way it worked. And it used to be the way it worked. And I think probably part of the reason that it was that way is because that's how it was earlier, especially after the Soviet Union dissolved, that the U.S. could just literally tell people what they wanted to do. And they would either do it or we would tell them pound sand. I mean, George Bush was a famous one for that. He blew off both our own allies in Europe and definitely just ignored the heck out of anybody in Russia with NATO expansion, with the war in Iraq in 2003. I mean, we made enemies all over the place, but we were so powerful and strong, we just frankly didn't care. So we did whatever we wanted until they came to us, and they always did. It's not 1990 anymore. It's not 2003 anymore. It's now a completely different situation here. And if anybody needs any more notice other than the fact that they met, it's also what he talked about there. So as I said, the conditions there, entry level, where everybody's like, all right, here's the first discussion to end the Russia-Ukraine war. But now that you see that the two sides seem to be talking about a whole lot more than just the Russia-Ukraine war, and in fact, that only had about 25% of the mention. He said that they wanted to appoint teams to reestablish functionality in the embassies. So he says, all right, we're going to not just have this one conversation. This is the start of a reconnection of normal relations, diplomatic relations between one of the world's biggest economic and military powers. It's just normal relations. So that's number one. And that was mentioned first, and that's important. Second was that they're going to appoint a team to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Appoint a team. So it's almost like, oh yeah, and this thing about this war, yeah, we're going to get somebody to talk about that very soon, and we'll get back to that. Anyway, moving on, then they move to number 3, which is this is probably the most important one. Examine the economic and geopolitical cooperation that could result after the war is over. This should be ringing loud and clear all over the Western world. The United States and Russia are already mentally moving beyond the Russia-Ukraine war. And the Trump administration is putting behind it everything that the Biden administration worked so painfully to destroy. I mean, let's be honest about it. And the fact that not only did we never talk to the Russians, we never had any kind of an achievable military plan, diplomatic, economic, or otherwise. We just had actions that we threw out there that just kept the war going. We kept Ukraine having enough weapons to prevent a rapid defeat, but there was never enough weapons that we could have sent that could ever have changed the outcome for Ukraine victory. Some have claimed that, well, Biden just gave things in dribs and drabs, and if he had just given everything all at once, then Ukraine could have won. No. Listen to me. This is so important to understand, because a lot of people claim that. Like, this is a result of the failure of the Biden administration. The loss is not a failure of the Biden administration. It was always ordained. If Biden had done that, let's say that in 2023, instead of giving them the small number of tanks that we gave for the U.S. tanks anyway, and a limited number of other European tanks and whatever, we'd given them hundreds, plural, of the M1 tanks, the Challengers, the AMX-10s from France, the British tanks, the German tanks, all that, like hundreds of them, enough to outfit 7, 8 different armored divisions. And somehow we had managed to actually train up the troops in a way that they could have used them. This is hypothetical, because there would, even if you'd given that ammunition and equipment, their troops would never have been trained enough well to use them. But for the moment, let's say that did succeed. If they started driving Russia physically out and driving them back to their country, we almost certainly would have had nuclear war. Joe Biden knew this, by the way. There is evidence out there in the public realm that they knew that, and that's why they didn't give them enough stuff to take that risk. So Biden didn't want to risk getting into nuclear war. He didn't want to risk getting into war with Russia, but he did want to keep the fighting going to, quote, weaken Russia. Now, as I've told you 100 times, and we'll do it one last time here, not only did we not weaken Russia, Russia is now stronger than it was militarily before, substantially stronger. And that is going to be something we need to deal with for a long time. But the bottom line is that this absurd path that we had been on was self-destructive for Ukraine, and it was catastrophic for our own interests, because now every Western European country, to include the United States, is now their military capacities are weaker today than they were before, because so much of their infrastructure was handed over to Ukraine to be destroyed on the battlefield. So we're weaker than we are today. We have fewer air defense missiles. We have fewer air defense systems. Some of our strategic reserves and tanks and armored personnel carriers, Bradley fighting vehicles, artillery systems, etc., those things are now much smaller than they were before. Our inventory of artillery ammunition significantly weakened across all of NATO. In the event that we would get into a war somewhere, our own stocks are now insufficient just to meet our defensive needs, let alone actually sustaining a long-term war. So everything that had been done up to this point has been a disaster for the Ukraine and for the United States. So it is long overdue that we have a big change in what's going on. And now it appears that the United States and Russia are going down that path. that because the war, even though Russia is stronger, they don't want to fight a war. There's a lot of other things they would prefer to do. And according to their own assessments, they would like to have peace, and they want to have security on their border, and then they want to do business with people around the world. They want to have economic prosperity for their own people, et cetera, and they can do that best in the absence of war fighting. As it turns out, so can we. We benefit from this. Western Europe would benefit from this. Getting this war off the table is good for everybody, with the possible personal exception of the leaders of the Western countries who have supported these bad policies, and definitely for Volodymyr Zelensky himself. But for everybody else, and that includes everybody in Ukraine who is alive today, would benefit from this war coming to a rapid and quick close based on the realities on the ground. And it's going to be ugly, folks. There's no good way to put it. Can't put lipstick on this pig. It's going to be ugly. But an ugly end, keeping everybody else alive, is a great thing, and something that we ought to be pursuing aggressively, as it appears that we are. But everybody in the West needs to be sober-minded to understand it's going to be an ugly pig with no lipstick. That's just all there is to it. And yet, that's what we should pursue, because if we don't, something worse could be following. But now, one of the other things that's kind of in the news right now that a lot of people have been talking about both yesterday and today is that, well, we are sidelining Volodymyr Zelensky, one of the key guys that's involved in the war. The leader of the two sides that's involved in the war with Russia and Ukraine is not even at the table in Riyadh. What's up with that? Well, Rubio had a bit of a claim that wasn't the case, but then he kind of actually said it was.
No one is being sidelined here, but President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict. And from that could emerge some very positive things for the United States, for Europe, for Ukraine, for the world. But first, it begins by the end of this conflict. And so the only thing President Trump's trying to do is bring about peace.
And the only thing Zelensky wants to do is to prevent peace. Look, I know that's a thing that gets a lot of people unhappy, but I mean, those are the facts, folks. He doesn't want to end the war. He wants to continue the war, because if he ends the war, then his power is almost certainly going to come to an end, because in any scenario that the Russians would agree to, it's going to have to require the Ukraine side to conduct a presidential election. A lot of talk already is that maybe we can get to an end of war declaration or through negotiations possibly by April. More on that later. But then there would have to be an election, so that Russia wouldn't sign any kind of an official document until maybe October, when there would be an election, the results of an election, a presidential election in Ukraine. Because as you may know, Zelensky's term of service came to an end, and I think it was May of last year, and they've had no more elections. So his constitutional term ended, and he didn't leave office, and he didn't have another election. And people can say, well, they're on martial law, and so they shouldn't do it in wartime. That's irrelevant to the conversation. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. They didn't, is the bottom line. And there is legally nothing that's going to say he's obligated, or that anyone subsequent to him would be obligated by anything he would sign, because it would be, obviously very easy to say he was not the legitimate leader at the time. So Russia says, we're not going to do that. We're going to make sure that whoever signs this on the Ukraine side is authorized on their own constitution to do it by their own means. So Russia's like saying, whoever wins, wins. We don't care. It could be Zelensky, but it will be somebody who is legally the leader of their country. So that's what they're saying. That's what the United States seems to be agreeing with, because there's lots of talk that they're also saying, yeah, if it's a democracy, and especially if we can get the fighting stopped so that they can fairly conduct an election, yeah, we're for that. We're supposed to be for that, because that is democracy. One person who may not be for that, though, is Volodymyr Zelensky. So he was actually in Ankara today, in Turkey, talking to Erdogan, the leader there. And he was asked in the post-briefing press conference what he thought about not being in Ukraine.
Можете обговорювати що завгодно, але не можна приймати рішення без України, як завершити війну в Україні. Ті чи інші умови. І нас не запрошували на цю зустріч, російсько-американську зустріч в Саудівській Аравії. Для нас це було сюрпризом, я думаю, так, як і для багатьох. Я переконаний, для України, для нашого регіону, і для Європи принципово, щоб будь-які перемовини щодо закінчення війни відбувались не за спиною у ключових суб'єктів, яких зачіпають наслідки російської агресії. Мені здається, на сьогодні зрозуміло, що зброєю на полі бою в цій війні не переможе жодна з сторін.
Okay, a few things are really important there. Number one is he said that we were surprised that we were not invited to Saudi Arabia for these meetings. Yeah, but was he? Could he have been surprised? I mean, if you've just been reading headlines around the world, forget about if you've been actually reading stories and watching the news, etc. Nobody should have been surprised that Ukraine wasn't invited. The meetings had been set for a long time. The conversations that were in Europe and in these meetings in Munich with all these leaders, it was talked about there that we're going to talk to the Russians. But Trump has been saying for a long time that he's going to talk to the Russians. He had a conversation already for a long time that he's talked to the Russians, that he was going to set up the meetings that would eventually lead to Putin and Trump themselves to be able to meet, etc. Everybody knew that that was going to happen. Everybody knew that Zelensky was not on the invite list. And in fact, it was a big sore point during the meetings in Munich. We've shown you in some of our previous episodes some of the moderator questions to General Kellogg saying, wait, so you're saying that you're going to have a meeting in Saudi Arabia and Europe's not going to be there and Zelensky's not going to be there? And he said, that's correct. He goes, Ukraine will be involved, but there's only going to be two protagonists. So he point blank said before he left Munich, Kellogg's did, that there would only be two people talking in Riyadh. So now then, how can you have today Zelensky claiming, well, we're as surprised by this as anyone? That's obviously untrue. It's just point blank untrue. So that's one strike against him already. Then he says, none of this stuff can be done behind the backs of the people who are there, meaning Europe and Zelensky. And listen, we have to be honest here. And sometimes, it's not a movie to where you have to be polite. It's not, a formal event where you have to be kind to somebody, maybe if you don't like them. When you're talking about life and death, when you're talking about the potential for things escalating into the point to where there could potentially be a nuclear war, that's not the time for politeness. That's the time for frankness and forthrightness. And as I alluded at the beginning of this episode here, there is a 3-year-long track record that Europe and both in the previous administration in the United States were abject failures in everything that led up to this point that we're in right now. All of these losses that Ukraine has had on the battlefield were all predictable. They were all, I called virtually every one of them, and it's no great benefit to me, nothing special. I'm just willing to look at the balance of power between the two sides, at the military fundamentals that are involved on the actual battlefield, etc. It's easy. It was easy to call. And yet, all of these senior people, all of these heads of state of NATO who met in Paris under this big emergency meeting that they had yesterday, all these people were the culprits. They were the architects of all of this failure. Now, why would the incoming Trump administration and the Russians, who are the primary protagonists, because without the United States, none of this war would have been supported. It would have ended long time ago. So we have kept it alive, and we can bring it to an end. So if you're talking about these two protagonists here, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, why would they want to have an equal seat at the table? The guy who had made the worst political decisions and diplomatic decisions in Volodymyr Zelensky, who at least on 4 major occasions ejected diplomatic end to this, that he could have either prevented the war from starting or ending it after it did start in a number of places, and has refused every time. Why would that guy, the same guy who went on Piers Morgan and said, hey, give me nuclear weapons, the same guy who, after Pete Hegseth said that NATO is not on the table, said NATO is still on the table. That guy, why would you want him in a meeting with you when you're going to discuss what's coming next? You wouldn't, because he can't act rationally. He can't. And the European people, even though they are rational actors, but they have this mentality that says only conflict with Russia. Russia is evil, period, point blank, end of story. You can't negotiate with evil, all that kind of stuff. Why would you want them at a table where you're trying to come to an end of a negotiation to end the conflict? Now, Europe has always been following behind the United States in the last 80 years, since the World War II was over. That's just been the reflexive way of things. And I'm sure that's going to work out here too. As a matter of fact, we had Gary. I'm going to give you a little bit out of order here. I'm going to go to Keir Starmer next. He made a statement last night where he said, as he was heading into this meeting in Europe, that he understood that some things were different. In this clip you're about to see here, the first thing he's going to talk about is that the U.S. delegation to Munich said that there's going to have to be a lot bigger carry and a heavier lift by the European NATO members than there has been in the past. So he's going to address that first, but then he's going to talk about what he thinks should come next in the Russia-Ukraine war.
The issue of burden sharing is not new, but it is now pressing. And Europeans will have to step up, both in terms of spending and the capabilities that we provide. On Ukraine, we're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground, alongside others, if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. So I will go to Washington next week to meet President Trump and to discuss what we see as the key elements of a lasting peace.
Now, interesting things here. So the first part, he has conceded, yes, Europe has to do more for NATO. So we're going to have to step up that spending. But then he says, but we still need troops on the ground to keep Russia from attacking into Ukraine in the future after some kind of an agreement is met. So they're still thinking that Russia only in the always evil, always trying to be Hitler, trying to go to, to the Paris or something like that, driving all the way across Europe, all this nonsense that's been said from the beginning. It's never been true, but they keep saying it. He's still kind of in that mindset. But you see it's changing. You see there's a shift, because he said, yes, I'm willing to consider, not that he declared, using British troops. And then he also said, but even if we do that, none of this stuff is going to work unless we have security guarantees from the United States for Ukraine. And I think it's pretty clear there's not going to be any. There will be no security guarantees from the United States for Ukraine. The United States, President Trump wants to end this war. He wants to get it off the table so we can get to the things that Rubio just outlined are the most important things for him, which is an improvement and back to normal relations with the nuclear superpower in Russia, so that we can have stable relations and positive and peaceful conditions within Europe, within our allies there. We also want that. But it's not going to be going down the old path, which was an utter disaster. It's going to be going down the new path. And at the end of that, he said, and I'm going to be going to Washington next week to talk to Trump. Wonder how that one will go. So that coming out of the WarMongers group, all these 8 European leaders who have been doing nothing but wanting to keep the war going the entire 3 years before Trump came in there. And I assure you, with all conviction, had Kamala Harris won instead of Trump, all of them would still be singing the same song they had for the previous 3 years. We have to double down. We have to keep going, etc. So now then there's, as J.D. Vance said, a new sheriff in town. And so there's going to be a new set of rules. And if Europe is going to be following the United States, then they're going to have to follow in a different direction, because these guys are still trying to go in a different direction. Now, the fact that you've heard almost nothing coming out of Paris, where the WarMongers met, tells you that they are probably coming to recognize, as we heard Keir Starmer admit here, maybe that path isn't the best one anymore, and we're willing to consider alternatives. And I very highly suspect that when he comes to Washington, he's going to be singing a different tune than he was last night. We'll see how that works out. But somebody who's not going to be singing a different tune and will be singing the same tune is the Russian side. And Sergei Lavrov addressed one of the issues also, I think, yesterday that Keir Starmer raised here about the possibility of having a negotiated settlement that includes Western troops.
I really don't know what they have to do at the negotiations table if they still want to trick the conflict into freezing for a while. while staying true to their habits of continuing the war, then why should they be invited to the table at all?
So you see that from the Russian perspective, why should that he said they, and I think in that context they meant both Zelensky and Europe. That he said they've been nothing. All of them have been nothing but suggesting a military conflict from the beginning. So if someone's negotiating it in, they don't have any place in that. But on the specific issue of the troops that are involved, he added this:
deployment of armed troops from NATO countries under any different flag, under an EU flag or under national flags, doesn't change anything. It's unacceptable to us.
And listen, folks, again, we're in power politics here. There's no right and wrong. There's no this person's morally correct and this person's not, because those things don't matter. Not for war and peace, they don't matter. Obviously, morality matters tremendously amount in anything that you're doing and how you conduct your affairs and how you live your life. But war itself doesn't care about that. It doesn't care who is right. Somebody could be absolutely 100% morally correct, true, proper, and good. But if the other side has the balance of power on its side, and we've seen this unfortunately happen many times in history, that side will win a conflict and it will defeat the good side. That's just a fact. And so when we're talking about how should we end this war and how can we get it off the table at the least cost of life, at the least cost available on any category for the Western side, we have to acknowledge ground truth reality. And right now, the ground truth reality is that Russia is irrevocably on the power side, on the advantage. And that advantage grows by the week. It keeps getting stronger and stronger while the Ukraine side shrinks on a daily basis as well in the opposite direction. So the balance is continuing to shift. And we see that playing out even on the battlefield there. After about a 2-week, it wasn't a pause actually, but a slowdown in the Russian advance here in the last 48 hours, it's picked back up. And in some areas, it's accelerating even what it was before this slowdown that had happened. So everything is continuing to fall apart on the front lines here. And the longer this goes on, the greater the risk and the possibility that the Ukraine army could collapse and it could fall apart. So you can see time is not on the Western side. Time is not on the United States. It's not on Trump's side. It's not on Europe's side, NATO side, Zelensky's side. It's not on our side, because if we keep holding out for something that's unattainable, and you have Sergei Lavrov telling you this idea of having peacekeeping troops that are Western troops, that are many of them are NATO troops, it's a complete non-starter. They won't even contemplate it. So they won't have any kind of an end to fighting negotiated settlement if that is something that we're pushing for. And if we keep hoping for that and saying, no, we're going to keep it on the table, then Russia's going to go, okay, you can keep it on your table. It ain't coming to my table. And we'll just keep doing what we've been doing, which is fighting on the front lines. We'll just continue to move to the west. The longer you wait to come to an agreement, there won't be any dividing line. Just look at any map right now. Go to the Institute for the Study of War. Even though they have terrible analysis, they got great maps. And it'll show you where the front line is right now. So go look on where that is today. And especially if you watch this at some point in the future, take a look at where the line will end up. Because we could have a negotiated settlement right now by just saying, all right, we accede to reality. We're going to get this off the table like as fast as possible. And we're going to agree to Russia's minimum terms that we can live with, which they're saying, which Putin has said from 14 June. We've talked about that a lot of times. If we don't, and if we say, but we want peacekeepers, Western peacekeepers as part of this thing to separate the two sides, then Russia will just say nope, and we'll just keep going to the West. And until that finally comes into reality, then that's where it's going to end up. And there'll be a whole lot more people dead, and there'll be even less Ukrainian territory left under Kiev control. That's just the reality of it. But it's not just the Europeans who can't seem to come to that reality. You have one of the biggest, most popular figures in America, former CIA director, former four-star general, David Petraeus, seems to be even more disconnected than they are.
There has to be a security guarantee. I can't imagine that Ukraine could agree to anything that did not include a robust security guarantee. The question is, what could be in it? Just beyond a military response, could it include, for example, automatic seizure of the $300 billion of Russian assets sitting in European banks? Could it include an automatic path to NATO membership for Ukraine. All of this in addition to whatever the military action might be taken by probably a coalition of the willing. In an ideal world, it would be a NATO operation led by an American three-star, let's say, with a core headquarters that is then built into a NATO coalition headquarters with lots of European and U.S. assets.
That is just stunning to me, that you have this former four-star general, somebody that we once thought was so smart, we put him at the head of the CIA, actually is saying now, not just that there should be some non-aligned Western troops, or even from some third party outside of Europe, possibly. Russia wouldn't go for that, but you could say, well, but they're not going to be for either side, et cetera. He's going so far as to say a NATO mission on the border with Russia with an American command in the auspices of NATO. And he thinks that's plausible. That is insane. Russia went to war because of the prospect of having NATO on their border. And you think that they're going to allow any kind of a situation that would insert NATO-backed troops on the physical border with Russia? It is beyond absurd that he would even suggest such a thing. All that's going to do is make Russia fight harder and push more. And short of the introduction of foreign troops, not just support, but troops, there is no possibility that the Ukraine side by itself can prevent Russia from conquering even more territory, even if it takes a long time, even if they continue fighting and dying in large numbers, they can still shovel more people into the breach there. But who's that going to benefit? All that will do, folks, is increase the cost of this war for the Ukraine side. It will increase the cost to lose. The war has been concluded in terms of its outcome. We know it. Russia won. The Ukraine side, backed by NATO, lost. It's abhorrent to say, and I get it. I don't even like to say it. I feel some embarrassment myself and some shame from it, because I was a servant, served in the United States Army. I served in Europe, so I was part of NATO forces, and it's embarrassing to me, and it's a mark of shame that this once powerful and brilliant military organization that used to be filled with a lot of wise people who made good decisions that kept us safe has descended to the point now where they can't even see basic reality. And of course, this extends all across the Western thinking. There's actually a piece, let me show you real quick, in the Kiev Post today that's written, that says, opinion present at the destruction. And as you read this, he says, Trump is destroying the foundations of unprecedented peace, security, and prosperity the United States essentially built 80 years ago and has enjoyed ever since. And folks, listen, that mentality is part of the problem here, because these folks, they can't see that it's not 80 years ago. Even when I'm talking about when I was serving in NATO during the Cold War, before the USSR fell, that's how far back I go. I started in 1985, the first time I was in a NATO organization in the European continent, for fighting for serving in the U.S. Army. We were fighting then, and that's when it was preserving the peace. It was doing really good work, and it had been since 1949. It had kept the peace. And this guy's thinking, though, it's still 1949. These viewpoints of people saying, yeah, what was done for the last 80 years should go on for another 80 years. That's what they think, even though, and here's where they have their fatal flaw, they can't get that it's not 1949 anymore. That we just finished a catastrophic global war where 60 million people were killed, and vast portions of Europe were just laid to waste and just destroyed, and that the Western countries that emerged out of it were badly weakened. They had lost millions of their men, so that their human capital was badly damaged, and it would take a generation or two to build back up, etc. That's not the world we have today, folks. So why should you have a security architecture today that mirrors what existed in 1949 when the conditions today are radically different? Now then, you have a whole Europe. You have rich cities. I've spent a lot of time in Europe. Love going there. It's a very modern place, great culture, wonderful food. It's a great place to go. They can afford there's nothing that's worse in Europe that's better in the United States. I've been around here too. And in some cases, you can even argue that they're more modern and better, certain things in Europe than there is here. But in any case, they can afford the same things that we can. And if they think their security is at risk, then they can take the appropriate measures to have the security forces that they need. But see, these people think, no, we need to keep NATO just like it was 80 years ago forever. And so they can't undo that. But David Petraeus, it's fatal. He can't get out of his mindset that it's not 1949 anymore, or not even 1985 anymore. But it is. It is past that. And now then there's new realities, and we need to acknowledge that. So we have to move forward into something else. Now, I've showed you at the outset of this what the U.S. side said after the meeting with Russia. Let me show you what the Russian side said, because there's some things to be optimistic about here, and some real possibilities that things could get better if I can find that. All right, I'm going to have to do something different. Sorry about that for the minute, folks. Let's see. I think it's this one right here. There we go. So let me pull that back up. I truly apologize. I thought I had it all set up. But this is good, because this shows that Russia is also saying, hey, we're ready to do some good things here too, because they want the war to end. These are some of the comments. This is Ria Novosti, by the way. This is converted into English on Google Translate, just so you know. You can do that if you want on your own. It says this is what the delegation said. And some of the key things here are that the delegations were engaged. This is from the Russian viewpoint afterwards. This is what they published. The delegations were engaged in establishing relations between the two countries. This was, quote, quite successful. So they're already coming out of there saying this is successful. And what you're going to see here, by the way, is not that Russia's secretly trying to set the stage, as was claimed in Munich last week, like it's 1938 Munich, that they're just trying to get rid of Ukraine so that they can come crashing down on everybody else in Europe. That's ridiculous, and it's absurd, because the Russians are saying that's not what we want. We don't even want that. That's not even aspiration. As it was for Hitler, by the way, in 1938, he had aspirations on the rest of the continent, and everybody knew it. That is not the case here, and the things that Russia's coming out saying prove that, or at least give evidence of that. I guess it's a better way to say it. The negotiations felt full determination, concrete determination to promote relations between the countries in an active way. So what you're going to see written through many of these things here is basically all four of the points that Secretary Rubio said. So you have, coming out of this meeting, both sides saying basically the same thing. We want to improve relations with each other. We want to see peace brought to Ukraine, and we want the war to come to an end so that we can get back to, having relations that can make everything better for all the different parties. And one of the key things I thought that it's important to point out here, because it was something that was mentioned before, and that was, I'm sorry, that's the American side that was saying here. See, this and this is again was something echoed by Rubio. We agreed that we will take into account each other's interests, but at the same time promote bilateral relations. Both Moscow and Washington are interested in this, said the presidential aide. They also said that, which we saw Sergei Lavrov say there a second ago, they reiterated here, and this is really important. Russian representatives told the American delegations that it was unacceptable for Moscow to have NATO troops in Ukraine, even if they were under the auspices of a European Union with foreign or other national flags. So the Ukraine, or the Russian side, reiterated, among all the positive things they said, they reiterated that there's not going to be any kind of troops in here, because that's not something that's useful and something they simply won't tolerate. If we press down that road, then the war will continue on. So I want to leave you with this understanding here that is so important for everybody to understand. If these delegations move quickly, that the current line of contact or something close to it can be where the war comes to an end, or more appropriately, the four administrative borders of the four oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That's the minimum that Russia will even talking about. And there's many voices in Russia, by the way, which frankly hope these negotiations don't succeed, because they want any kind of excuse to keep fighting. There is a definite hardline view in Russia right now. And you need to understand this too, that does not want a peace to happen here. They don't want Putin to be successful here, because they want to be, quote, forced into continuing to take on the ground what they want for their national security. And they're willing, and they are definitely able to do it. We definitely should not put them in a position to have to prove that. It is in America's vital national interest. It is in America's national interest, and it is in Ukraine's vital national interest to get this war off the table as soon as possible, whatever Zelensky thinks. And if it comes down to it, where Zelensky says, I don't care what you say, Mr. Trump, I'm going to keep fighting, then I think that Trump should be ready to do the really hard thing, because it'd be hard domestically as well as internationally, to say, okay, you're a sovereign country. You're the head of the country. You can do what you think is in your best interest. I'm going to do what's in my best interest. We will no longer from this day forward provide any more weapons, ammunition, or support. Any personnel we have in your country will be withdrawn back to our forces, and we will wish you luck. And then we'll see how it goes from that point forward. Because as abhorrent as it may sound to my Western friends, to do anything besides that, to continue the fiction that we're going to support Ukraine, to be unwilling to have the tough concessions necessary to end the war where it is now, will almost certainly result in hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainian men being killed, and the line going, we don't even know how far it could go, up the Dnieper River. It could include Odessa. It could include Kharkiv City. It could even put the Kiev itself back in the crosshairs again. All those things are possible if we don't reach a negotiated settlement right now while we have the chance. That's how important this is, and that's what is on the table here right now, what we need to be careful about. Thank you very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. And as this thing develops, believe me, every time there's any further developments, any other comments, any other statements, and as this thing does evolve, we will be right here with you to give you some great commentary, great guests who are very well connected with this, both in the United States and in Europe, until we get this thing off the table. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.